Is morality truly a thing? In this episode, I try to cover different systems of moral values and whether morality truly exists or not. Hello, my name's Paul Hemmelstrand. This is Refining Reason. In today's episode, I'll be talking about morality. This is a real fun one. What is my end goal here? Well, this is a little bit different than most of my other episodes. This is really more of a question than it is an answer. Because when I'm talking about morality, this is something that I've studied probably for 3 or 4 years now, trying to get to what really is morality or not. And what I'm getting closer and closer to is what I would qualify as either moral anti-realism or moral quasi-realism. What does that mean? Well, moral anti-realism is essentially that there isn't really such thing as an inherently good or bad thing. There are things that can be harmful to a society or to the individual, and there's other factors that come into play, but there isn't necessarily something good or bad. And I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, this means that you're saying that you could just kill anybody you want. And no, I'm not saying that at all. And I'll demonstrate what I mean by that later. But, when I was studying morality, I kind of ran into some problems. And, if you have some type of solution, if you have some kind of solution to anything I'm talking about, just let me know in the comments. Obviously, I'm open to stuff because if there is a moral system, I would like to know about it. So, I would say my journey would start out as that, I used to be a Christian. If you've seen any of my older videos, obviously that changed. So I don't have any religious moral values. And so obviously that left me with nothing to go on. So I kind of stumbled across a variety of things. So the first one would be the Milgram Experiment. So the Milgram Experiment was one where basically it was to test why people in Nazi Germany did some of the horrific things that they did. And what they found was that, the way they set it up was they had a guy in a lab coat that was kind of representing an authority figure. And then they had an actual test subject on one side of this barrier where there was a pretend person on the other side. They just had audio recordings for their response. And what they do is they would deliver shocks at the order of the lab guy. These are just perfectly normal people in America. And so they tell them, okay, we just need you to deliver this small shock. And they do it. Most people had no problem with that. And then and the shock was delivered based on whether they answered something correctly. So they'd up the shock amount. And, depending how much voltage they did, some people would actually back out and say they weren't going to do it. But there was plenty of people that just kept going along with it, basically because the guy in the lab coat would say that that the study must continue, that this thing has to continue, and it's important that we continue, and something along that effect. And so there was, in some cases, people who were literally keep doing it, where they would hear some type of noise from somebody where it would just be like, just like a light shock. And then when they up the voltage, they get to the point of screaming. And at one point, they wouldn't hear anything at all, kind of simulating that they died. And they would still continue to tell them to shock them. And in some cases, people did. So if it was real voltage with real people involved, they would have been killing people in the experiment. So, that kind of goes to show you how someone can be manipulated into doing something, even if they're perfectly normal people. So to follow up on that I looked at was the Stanford prison experiment. And both of these I'm going to have down in the description if you're interested in them. They're really good things to watch and read about, give you some insight into things. But the Stanford prison experiment was a little bit closer to me because I used to be a police officer. And what they shown in that case was another type of authority type dynamic, except this was a lot different, where they basically pooled a bunch of college students, and these students were randomly selected for their roles. One section of the group was considered inmates, and another section was considered guards. There was no real criteria on who was going to be one or the other. And yet, despite them being no different from each other, the people who assumed the guard roles were increasingly hostile towards the inmates. And I have to reiterate that these people are no different from each other. And, it was actually an experiment that was really controversial because they really just let the students run with it. They didn't have too much control in the experiment. They've tried to replicate it, but without that natural process of letting them do whatever they wanted, they weren't able to do the same thing. But that's besides the point. What I'm getting at is that these are two cases of people who were perfectly normal in these studies that did some bad things. So where did I go after that? Well, I looked at things like utilitarianism and secular humanism and various other isms. And the one that I think makes the most sense, if you're going to adopt any style of morality, would be secular humanism at this moment. This is something that's been popularized by Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris. I'm sure there's plenty of other people as well. But the central idea behind it is that you have what's considered objective moral values, and an objective foundation is the core of this. So generally, there's factors in life that are beneficial to well-being and some things that aren't. Life is preferable to death, pain, or pleasures in preference to suffering. So, for example, death would be considered a decrease in your well-being, so it's generally not preferred. And then you basically just go down into more specific categories to determine whether or not they're moral or not. There's a problem, though. So, if everyone believed in this principle, I'd be perfectly fine. It's not a matter of whether I think one system is, or if this specific system is completely wrong, or if other ones are wrong. It's more of whether or not morality is an actual thing, and if it can actually be decided with just one type of criteria. Because what I'm kind of arguing is that there is multiple criteria involved. I don't think it just fits neatly into this one type of thing. And I know this, I'm trying not to sound, given that type of bro-y, there is no such thing as morality, everything you believe is a lie. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is something more complicated, I think, than people are trying to make it. So, what would I mean by that? How would I be able to determine whether something is good or bad if we don't have a clear indication of what that would be? Well, I was discussing this with somebody on Reddit, trying to kind of figure out if I was missing something or not. And, they brought up some scenarios. I brought up some as well. And I brought up one specifically that seemed to outline a problem with it, where you have, let's say, a group or a nation that decides that they're going to selectively breed people based on their genes. So the criteria would be, for example, if they're trying to eliminate the prevalence of cancer in future generations, then people who have a history of cancer would be no longer allowed to breed. And so you've got two different things when you're talking about well-being. You have physical well-being, that's the life and preference to death, and then mental well-being. That'd be things like depression and stuff along those lines. So in this situation, you would actually be promoting physical well-being, because no one's actually being killed in this situation. There's no real pain being delivered. What they're doing is allowing a situation to where there's no more cancer in the world, or at least less cancer, along with any disease you decide, and filling in. But obviously there's a problem there where mental well-being is at stake, because there's millions of people that want to have children, and some people would be very depressed about this. There's all kinds of mental issues that would come in play here, and so I would argue that that's not an objective moral foundation. And there's other scenarios that I played out with that, but so as far as assessing these in different ways, it really depends what we're talking about. So empathy, for example, if we don't have an idea of what morality is, how would we define what empathy is? Well, empathy is actually something that's pretty normal for primates and dogs, just in general. They've shown this in studies, that really empathy is just a biological factor that comes into play. You don't really need to be taught it. Obviously, there's people that have different degrees of it. Some people have more empathy and some people have less. But I would say that the best way to increase that is just simply teach more about empathy. But I don't think empathy is something that is kind of hard to explain. Like, I don't think having less or more of it is inherently bad or good. But obviously empathy is preferred because it leads to a better society. So yeah, going back to what I was talking about with like gene selection, this to me would be something that you could just argue for something along the lines of personal freedom or societal freedom, where their freedom is being diminished by something along that effect. And I think that while that fits something to diminish a problem with that specific situation, freedom alone isn't a criteria to evaluate whether something's harmful or not to a society. Because you could have all the freedom in the world but live a horrible life. This would be easy to demonstrate, such as if you were living on a desert island somewhere. No one's controlling you, but your life sucks. And then, this is actually, when I'm talking about developing morality, or morality just kind of formulating on its own, this is something that Friedrich Nietzsche talked about. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher, and one of the things he argued was that morality was very basic in its foundation, or its infancy. That morality would really only evolve to a point where, murder, for example, was considered a bad thing, but that societies tend to keep increasing what's considered moral or not, or further refining it, because it would almost be sort of boredom or unhappiness with themselves that they were able to achieve this morality and there was nothing else to factor into it. Because once you've eliminated murder out of the picture, there's a whole giant set of things to go over. And so he argued that this is something that would kind of develop with time, or with a developing society. And this is something that I would have to say would possibly default to something less without a society being involved, or a society declining. That these things that we consider moral or immoral would degrade if the society or certain structures were out of place. Now, I, of course, mentioned empathy, and those types of things would be natural, but even with certain types of groups being set up, even those could be dampened under the right circumstances. To sort of wrap this up, I'm not saying that everything that you do is pointless, or that morality should just be ignored. Well, what I would say is morality to me just isn't a clear thing, and that we can just address certain things with different criteria. Now, like I said, this is more of an open-ended question, I would say, that if you have some type of idea on what would be considered a true moral system or a true moral criteria that would apply across everything, I would be happy to hear about it. Hell, I would even be fine if you were trying to make a case that morality is a certain type of thing. But I would really just be discouraged with anything that's just making a case for something that's inherently good or inherently bad. And I think I've kind of covered that ad nauseum with those examples, with the two experiments and other factors, that while I might think something is evil, like I have plenty of things I think are wrong or good, but I don't think those are inherently good or bad. I think there's just a variety of factors that have played in to make me believe those things. And that's why people across the world would have totally different moral values than me, even though they might have just as much of a developed society or reasons to do some of the things they do. I just don't think it's a very clear thing. But yeah, so if you enjoyed this video, I have plenty of other videos you can watch, and you can subscribe if you enjoy it. Other than that, yeah, I will see you guys next time.